In the quiet mountains of Montana, an elderly couple abandoned by their own children turn a broken cabin into a home filled with hope, love, and memory. But when nature tests them, and loss strikes, what remains isn't a house but a legacy. If stories of love, endurance, and second chances speak to you, hit like, subscribe, and stay with me till the end. The autumn light over Billings, Montana had that kind of gold you could almost taste warm, fleeting, and heavy with endings. Walter Hayes sat on the front steps of his old clapboard house, his hands resting on his knees like someone guarding the edge of a memory. The house smelled faintly of pine cleaner and dust. Inside, his wife Margaret was folding the last of their linens into boxes marked storage. Her movements were careful, deliberate, as if every sheet folded was a negotiation between reason and heartbreak. Their children called it a fresh start, a safe transition. They said the cabin in Cedar Hollow would be peaceful quiet, perfect for Mom's lungs. They said it was time. Walter had stopped arguing weeks ago. The kids Thomas, Anna, and Luke had made up their minds the way successful adults do, quickly, efficiently, as if emotions were logistical problems that could be solved with signatures. The eldest Thomas was a banker in Denver. He had that clipped, competent voice that made everything sound like a business meeting. "Dad, we can't ignore Mom's health anymore," he'd said over dinner, his tone so calm it scraped. "That old house isn't good for her. The city air, the stairs, the heating bills, it's not sustainable." Anna had nodded her eyes on her plate. Luke didn't say much, just kept scrolling through his phone, as if every message was a lifeline pulling him away from the table. Walter had looked across at Margaret then. She was smiling politely the way people do when they know resistance will only make it hurt more. "It's just for a while," she said softly, placing her hand on his. "Maybe the mountain air will help, and we'll have time to rest." He knew what she didn't say aloud, that they weren't being invited to rest. They were being moved out of the way. When moving day came, the air was brittle and clean, the kind that made every sound sharper. Boxes stacked like tombstones in the driveway. Thomas had hired a moving company, 2 young men with tattoos and Bluetooth speakers that played country songs about freedom. Walter watched them carry out the furniture, each piece a small betrayal. The oak dining table he had built in his 20s. The piano Margaret once played lullabies on. The framed picture of their wedding day. He stood by the porch rail, his throat a desert. Margaret came out holding a small box, her oxygen tank hissing faintly behind her. She'd started needing it more often that year. "Did you take your coat?" She asked the question, an old habit, not a necessity. He nodded. Her eyes wandered across the yard to the willow tree they'd planted when Anna was born. Its branches hung low, yellowing as if bowing to some invisible weight. "They say the cabin's near a lake," she murmured. "Maybe it'll be beautiful." He wanted to tell her he'd seen the photo's gray wood caved roof, no electricity, but he couldn't bear to crush that small, trembling hope. Instead, he said, "Maybe it will." Thomas arrived last, his SUV gleaming like something out of another life. He wore an expensive jacket and that practiced, calm smile of people who never seem to question themselves. "Dad, Mom," he began, "Cedar Hollow's going to be good for you. Cleaner air, less stress. You'll be surrounded by nature." Walter stared at him at the polished shoes sinking slightly into the damp lawn. "And when winter comes?" he asked quietly. Thomas hesitated. "We'll visit, of course. And if it gets bad, we'll make arrangements. This is temporary." Temporary. A word that always seems harmless until it means forever. The drive to Cedar Hollow took 4 hours. The road climbed from rolling plains to the kind of wilderness where even cell service gave up. Margaret slept half the way, her head leaning gently against the window, her breath fogging the glass. Walter kept his eyes on the road, though, now. And then he glanced at her reflection, the faint smile, the faint pulse at her neck, the woman who'd followed him through 49 years of marriage in 5 states, and every dream that never quite worked out. When they arrived, the wind was already picking up. The cabin stood alone at the edge of the tree line, its paint stripped to bone, its roof sagging like tired shoulders. A single porch light flickered weakly from a solar panel barely clinging to the eaves. The mountain loomed behind it, tall, patient, indifferent. Thomas helped unload a few boxes, glancing often at his watch. "We stocked the pantry," he said, "and there's propane for the stove. I'll transfer money each month for groceries. The nearest town's about 45 minutes downhill." Margaret tried to smile. "Thank you, sweetheart." Walter's eyes traveled over the cabin, broken shutters, a cracked window, the smell of old ash in the air. "You call this peaceful," he muttered. Thomas's voice tightened. "Dad, please, don't start." There was a silence so thick it seemed to press on the air. Finally, Margaret said, "Let's go inside." Inside, the cabin was smaller than Walter expected. Dust clung to the corners. The furniture, donated mismatched, smelled faintly of mildew. But through the back window, there was a view of the valley below. The sun laying itself down behind the ridges like a dying ember. Margaret stood there for a long time, one hand on the windowsill, breathing shallowly as if trying to memorize it all. When Thomas left, the goodbye was brief. A hug that was more obligation than affection. "We'll come up soon," he promised. The SUV's tires spun gravel, then disappeared around the bend. The sound of the engine faded, leaving only wind. Walter looked at Margaret standing in that hollow cabin with a half-empty box beside her. So she said softly, "This is home." He swallowed hard. "Yeah. Home." That night, Walter couldn't sleep. The wind moaned through the cracks in the roof. He got up, pulled on his boots, and stepped outside. The stars above Cedar Hollow were sharp enough to cut. From up there, the world below looked impossibly far away. He thought of the children, of how quickly they had turned necessity into justification, guilt into care. He thought of Margaret's soft voice, saying maybe it'll be beautiful. He whispered into the wind, "You deserve better than this." But the mountain didn't answer. Only the rustle of pine and the quiet rasp of his own heart reminded him he was still here, still the man trying to make peace with a life that no longer belonged to him. And inside, Margaret stirred, her breathing steady, her face turned toward the window where dawn would come too soon. The first morning in Cedar Hollow arrived without sound. The air was so still that even the trees seemed to be listening. Walter woke to the faint hiss of Margaret's oxygen tank, a steady rhythm that had become part of their nights. The thin light from the cracked window spilled across the wooden floor, revealing dust motes that looked like suspended time. He rose quietly, pulling on his flannel shirt, and stepped outside. The cold bit into his skin like small, deliberate teeth. The mountain air was clean, yes, but clean in the way of untouched places, indifferent to whether one lived or died. The generator had refused to start during the night, and the solar battery barely kept the small lamp alive. He ran his hand along the porch railing. The wood was soft with rot. Everything smelled faintly of mold and smoke. Inside, Margaret sat wrapped in a quilt, pale but composed, a mug of tea cooling in her hands. "It's colder than I expected," she whispered, her voice rough. Walter nodded, setting down the toolbox he had unpacked the night before. "I'll fix the roof first," he said, "then see if I can get the pump working." She gave him a faint smile. "You always start with the roof." He looked at her for a long moment, at the way her gray hair caught the morning light. "Keeps the rain off your head," he murmured. By midday, he was standing on the roof, hammer in hand, staring down at the valley below. The shingles curled like the pages of an old book. He pried one loose, the wood beneath spongy and black. Every strike of his hammer echoed through the valley, a lonely, hollow rhythm that belonged to no one but him. His arms trembled with effort, his breath coming in short, shallow bursts, but he kept working. Sweat mixed with dust on his forehead. The sky hung low, heavy with unfallen rain. Inside, Margaret coughed a deep, tearing sound that seemed to shake the small cabin. Walter climbed down quickly, his boots crunching over the damp soil. When he opened the door, she was sitting on the bed, her hand pressed against a handkerchief, already stained red. He froze. "It's fine," she said quickly, folding the cloth away. "Just the air. It's too thin up here." But her lips were trembling. Walter knelt beside her, the smell of wet earth still clinging to his clothes. "We'll go back down if it gets worse." She shook her head. "No, we just got here. Let's give it a chance." He wanted to argue, but her eyes stopped him, the same eyes that had once convinced him to leave everything behind and start over more than once. "All right," he said quietly. "We'll stay." The next few days blurred together. The propane stove sputtered, the water pump groaned and refused to yield. Walter boiled snow on the stove for drinking. At night, the cold crept in through every seam of the cabin. He burned wet wood that smoked more than it flamed, filling the air with a bitter haze that made Margaret's cough worse. Still, she smiled when he tucked the blanket tighter around her. "You always said you wanted peace and quiet," she teased. He forced a grin. Didn't think peace would sound so much like freezing to death. On the fourth day, while searching for old nails in the attic, Walter found something unexpected. The space was cramped, filled with forgotten relics, broken jars, a rusted lantern, a mouse nest made from torn newspaper dated 1954. He was about to climb down when his flashlight caught a glint in the corner. It was a small, leather-bound book, half buried under dust. He brushed it off the cover, cracked but intact. The first page carried a name, written in careful, deliberate cursive, Eleanor Whitmore, Cedar Hollow, 1954. Below it in smaller handwriting, a line that stopped him cold. "If you're reading this, it means this place isn't dead yet." The words felt oddly alive, like a voice whispering across decades. He sat there for a while, listening to the soft groan of the rafters, to the hush of wind pressing against the roof. The house creaked in response, as though aware of being remembered. He turned the page. The ink had faded, but the writing was steady, neat, patient. "We came here after losing everything. My husband said the mountain would give us peace. It didn't. But it gave us work, and maybe that's close enough." Walter closed the book and held it for a long time. His hands shook slightly, not from cold this time, but from the strange weight of recognition. Downstairs, Margaret's cough echoed again, sharp, distant. He took a deep breath, set the book under his arm, and climbed down carefully. She was asleep when he returned, her breathing shallow but steady. He sat beside her and placed the old journal on the small table near the bed. For a moment, he simply watched her sleep. The lamplight touched her face gently, softening the lines of worry that had deepened over the past years. He thought about Eleanor Whitmore and her husband, two strangers, who had probably stood where he was standing now, wondering how long they could keep going. Outside, the first drops of rain began to fall, slow, deliberate tapping against the patched roof like hesitant applause. Walter looked up, half expecting to see the ceiling give way, but it held. For now. He picked up the journal again and turned another page. The hardest part isn't the cold or the hunger, it's the quiet. It makes you hear things, your own thoughts mostly, they echo here. Walter smiled faintly, closing the book. "You're right, Eleanor," he whispered. "It's too quiet." He rose, checked the stove, and fed another piece of damp wood into the flame. The smoke curled lazily toward the cracked ceiling. Margaret stirred, murmuring something he couldn't quite catch. He touched her hand gently, the warmth faint but real. "We'll make it through the week," he said. The rain thickened, drumming harder now. In the dim light, the old journal lay open on the table, the ink glistening faintly, as if remembering its own words. Outside, Cedar Hollow sank deeper into silence, and Walter sat watching the fire fight to live, wondering if the mountain too was listening. The snow began without warning, fine and silent, drifting down through the thin air like dust from a broken sky. Walter watched from the small window, the old journal resting on the table beside him, a candle flickering in a pool of wax. Outside, the trees bowed under the white weight of early winter. Margaret slept nearby, her breathing uneven, her skin pale against the worn quilt. The storm moved quickly. Within an hour, the path to the road had vanished, buried under a smooth, endless blanket. The radio gave its final breath a faint hiss before dying, and the generator refused to start. The world outside their door went still, as if holding its breath. By dusk, the cold had crept in through the walls. Margaret's cough deepened, each spasm leaving a trace of red on her handkerchief. Walter tried to hide his fear. "I'll get the stove going," he said, but the wood was damp, hissing instead of burning. The air filled with smoke, a gray, bitter fog that stung his eyes. He sat beside her and rubbed her hands, whispering small things meant to keep her awake. "Remember that winter in Oregon," he said. "You said the snow there looked like feathers." She smiled faintly. It didn't bite like this. Night fell early. The wind screamed against the shutters, the mountain roaring in its sleep. Around midnight, Margaret woke. Choking her breath, caught halfway between gasps, Walter scrambled for the oxygen tank, but the valve jammed. Panic clawed at his chest. "Breathe, Maggie," he said, his voice shaking. She tried eyes wide, but the air refused her. He lifted her wrapped in the quilt and staggered toward the back of the cabin. The wind howled through the cracks, tearing at the door. The only place sheltered from the draft was the old wood cellar beneath the floorboards. He opened the trapdoor with his boot and carried her down. The darkness smelled of soil and old ash. He laid her on the floor, fumbling for matches. The lantern was empty. His eyes fell on the family Bible, thick and dusty on a shelf. For a long moment he stared at it, then tore a page, his hands trembling. The paper caught quickly, the flame small but defiant. "Forgive me," he whispered as he fed in another page. The fire grew a fragile sun in the dark. Margaret's chest began to rise again slowly, painfully. She opened her eyes and found his face in the light. "You're still here," she breathed. "Always," he said. They stayed there until morning, the storm raging above them. When the wind finally eased, the silence that followed was heavier than noise. The windows were sealed by snow. The cabin was a cave of ice. Walter shoveled the doorway open with his hands, each breath cutting his lungs. The road was gone, the sky a gray blur. He looked at Margaret, still asleep, and knew he had to find help. He packed a thermos, wrapped himself in every layer he owned, and kissed her forehead. Back before dark, he promised, though he wasn't sure the words were true. The snow was deep, knee-high, and the wind sharp enough to steal breath. Each step took strength he didn't have. After 2 miles, his legs burned, but he kept moving head down, counting each step. The valley had disappeared. Everything was white and soundless. The cold pressed close, numbing, thought-numbing time. After 3 miles, the thermos froze shut. He turned his back to the wind and forced it open with his teeth, swallowing a mouthful of icy water. His shoulder throbbed from carrying her the night before, but he pushed on. At the 4th mile, the slope steepened. The snow hid patches of ice like traps. He stepped once, twice, and fell. The pain came like lightning, blinding, searing through his shoulder. He lay still, the world spinning. The sky was a sheet of iron. He tried to stand, but his left arm hung useless. For a moment he thought about closing his eyes. Then he saw her face. Margaret's pale in the firelight, whispering his name. He began to crawl. The snow burned against his skin, melted into his gloves, froze again. He crawled for hours, or maybe minutes. Time no longer mattered. When he saw the cabin again, it was only a shadow through the white. The light in the window flickered weakly. He tried to call her name, but his throat had turned to sand. The steps blurred in front of him. He reached for the door and missed. The world narrowed to the sound of wind and his heartbeat fading. He thought he heard someone calling back, a voice, thin and frightened. The door opened, and there she was. Margaret, wrapped in a blanket, her hair loose, tears streaking her face. Somehow, impossibly, she pulled him inside. The warmth hit him like a wave, the scent of smoke and wet wool. He felt her arms around him, her voice repeating his name again and again until it became something like prayer. He tried to speak, but only managed a faint sound. She pressed her forehead to his. "You came back," she whispered. His body shook uncontrollably, the pain spreading, but for the first time since the storm began, he felt something close to peace. She dragged him to the fire, the same one that had kept her alive and covered him with every blanket she could find. The edges of his vision blurred. He reached for her hand, held it tightly, then let go as the light dimmed. The storm outside began again, softer this time, as if the mountain itself had stopped to listen. When the snow finally began to melt, it did so slowly, like a wound reluctant to heal. The drifts retreated inch by inch, leaving behind patches of dark soil and the scent of thawing pine. Walter stood on the porch with his arm in a sling, watching rivulets of water carve paths through the mud. Each sound, the drip of melting ice, the groan of wood, felt like the earth itself remembering how to breathe. Inside, Margaret moved carefully, still weak, but alive. The storm had taken more from them than they could measure, yet she smiled when the first bird returned to the ridge. "Listen," she said one morning, pointing towards the trees. A faint trill answered, fragile but certain. "It sounds like forgiveness." Walter only nodded. He was not a man of easy words, but something in him softened at the sound. The days lengthened. The air, though still cold, carried a sweetness that hinted at life. The cabin, once sealed in silence, began to stir again. Walter repaired what he could, patching the roof, replacing the latch on the door, straightening the warped shelves. Each nail he hammered was a small defiance, a reminder that his hands still knew how to build. The shoulder hurt with every swing, but he didn't complain. Margaret would sit nearby, wrapped in her shawl, shelling beans, or writing in a small notebook. Sometimes she would read aloud from the journal he had found in the attic. Eleanor wrote that her husband fixed the well by hand, she said one afternoon, tracing the faded lines with her finger. "Maybe we can find it." Walter smiled faintly. "Maybe we can try." That evening, he followed the faint outline of the old water line behind the cabin. The snowmelt had revealed rusted pipes half buried in mud. He dug slowly with a spade, his breath rising in white clouds. The metal was brittle, eaten away by time. But when he reached a junction beneath a cluster of roots, he saw the problem. Thick tendrils of an old pine had grown through the pipe, strangling it shut. "Well," he muttered, wiping his brow, "guess you were thirsty too." He worked carefully, sawing through the roots, clearing each section with his good arm. It took the better part of 2 days. Margaret watched from the porch, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes bright with quiet pride. "Don't overdo it," she called. "You're not 30 anymore." He grinned up at her. "No, but I remember what it felt like." On the third morning, when the sun broke through the clouds, Walter turned the old valve at the base of the line. At first, nothing happened. Then, with a sudden hiss, water burst through the pipe, clear and cold, splashing across his hands. He laughed, a sound raw from disuse. "It's running," he shouted. Margaret came to the door, her face lit with something close to wonder. She cupped her hands beneath the stream, lifting a handful to her lips. "It tastes like new," she said. He dipped his hands too, letting the chill bite into his palms. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The water glistened in the sunlight, a ribbon of silver cutting through the dirt. They spent the rest of the day setting up a small basin inside the kitchen, channeling the water through a section of pipe he'd salvaged from the shed. The work was slow, but steady, filled with small victories, the sound of flow, the clean scent of wet metal. When it was done, Margaret filled a kettle and set it to boil. The steam rose in gentle curls, carrying warmth through the cabin. They sat at the table, their fingers brushing lightly over the wood. "You did it," she said softly. He shook his head. "We did." That night they ate soup made with the last of their potatoes, and a few wild herbs she had gathered near the creek. It was thin, but it tasted like gratitude. Outside, the snowmelt continued its quiet music, the mountain alive again. Walter leaned back in his chair, listening. "You hear that?" he asked. "The roof's not leaking. The pipes are running. The world's giving us a second chance." Margaret smiled, her eyes glistening in the firelight. "Then we should name it," she said. "This day." He looked at her. "Name it what?" She hesitated, then whispered, "Rebirth." Walter nodded slowly. "The day we started breathing again." She reached across the table and took his hand, her skin cool, but steady. For a long time they sat without speaking, the fire crackling, the wind soft for once. The journal lay open on the counter beside them, its pages fluttering gently as if in approval. "You think they made it?" she asked suddenly. Eleanor and her husband, Walter, looked toward the window where the moonlight pooled on the glass. "Maybe not," he said, "but they tried. And maybe that's enough." Outside, the creek carried their reflection, a man and a woman small against the mountain, but still here, still building, still trying. Margaret exhaled her breath, visible in the fading chill. "It's beautiful," she said quietly. Walter looked at her, really looked, and realized that beauty had always been this simple. Her voice, her presence, the sound of water running after so much silence. The fire dimmed to embers. He rose, turned off the lantern, and whispered, "We'll be fine." The words hung in the air, half promise, half prayer. Spring in Cedar Hollow did not arrive all at once. It crept in quietly through the cracks in the walls and the smell of wet soil after rain. The snowmelt had carved thin silver veins down the slopes, and where the ice once stood, small buds now reached toward the light. Walter and Margaret moved slowly through those weeks, their bodies still fragile, but their rhythm returning. Each morning she would open the window just enough to let in the smell of pine, and he would sit at the table sharpening old tools that no longer held much edge, but still fit his hand like memory. The water pipe ran clear now, its steady trickle a heartbeat under the floorboards. Margaret began saving the water in glass jars, lining them by the window where sunlight caught and scattered in bright shards across the room. "It makes the place look alive," she said. Walter smiled. "It's the cleanest thing we own." The days took on a pattern. Walter repaired what he could. Margaret made things grow. She had found an unused patch of earth behind the cabin where the snow melted first. It was small, no wider than the porch, but she knelt there with a patience that made Walter's chest ache. She planted seeds, beans, carrots, a few herbs, and spoke to them softly, as though they were old friends. "If we can coax life out of this soil," she said one afternoon, wiping her hands on her apron, "maybe we can coax it out of ourselves too." He watched her, the sun glinting off her gray hair, and thought she looked like someone who had decided to stay. When she tired, he brought her a chair and sat beside her, their silence comfortable, filled with the quiet sounds of wind and insects returning. Inside, the cabin began to feel less like a shelter and more like a home. Walter built shelves from leftover planks, sanding them smooth until his hands stopped shaking. He fixed the door, hinges replaced a window pane, and polished the table they had eaten their first meal on after the storm. Margaret made jam from the wild berries she gathered near the creek, her fingers stained red. The smell of sugar and fruit filled the air, mixing with the scent of wood smoke. "It smells like summer," she said. "It smells like work well done," he replied. In the evenings, they sat by the fire, each lost in quiet thought. Margaret had taken to writing again, filling the pages of an old ledger with neat, deliberate handwriting. Sometimes she wrote about the garden. Other times she wrote about her fears, the small ones that came at night when the wind picked up. "I write to remember who I am," she told him. "When everything changes, you forget the edges of yourself. This helps me find them again." He nodded. "Then write as much as you can." Walter had his own ritual. In the shed behind the cabin, among tools older than his children, he began building again. At first it was only repairs, a stool, a drawer, a frame for the mirror that had cracked in the move. But as the days warmed, he felt a pull to make something new. He found a few planks of cedar left from the previous owners and decided to build a cabinet for Margaret's jars and notebooks. The smell of sawdust filled the shed clean and comforting. He worked in the slow, careful way of a man who has learned that haste breaks more than it builds. His shoulder still ached from the fall, but the pain felt like proof of survival. Margaret visited often, bringing tea and small comments that made him laugh. "It's been years since you built anything that didn't have 4 walls, she teased. "Walls are overrated," he answered, running his hand along the grain of the wood. "This will hold what matters." When the cabinet was finished, he carried it inside and set it against the wall near the table. It stood solid and simple, its surface smooth under the light. Margaret ran her hand across it, tears welling in her eyes. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "It's yours," he said. Then he reached for his carving knife, the same one he had used in his youth, and carefully etched words into the inside of the door. "For as long as we can hold a hammer, we build. They stood side by side, reading the line as if it were a promise renewed. "You still believe that?" she asked quietly. "I have to," he replied. "Otherwise we stop being who we are." She smiled and leaned her head against his shoulder. The fire crackled softly, the scent of cedar rising between them. For the first time in months, the cabin felt warm, in a way that had nothing to do with heat. Days slipped into weeks. The garden sprouted green shoots that reached for the light. Birds returned to the eaves, weaving nests in the corners Walter had patched. Margaret's hands, once frail, grew steadier with each morning's work. She filled the cabinet with jars of jam-folded letters and the worn pages of her writing. Sometimes she would catch him watching her and laugh. "You're looking at me as if I were a miracle," she said. "You are," he answered simply. On a quiet afternoon, they sat outside, the sun low behind the trees. The air smelled of earth and resin. Margaret closed her notebook and looked at him. "Do you think they'll ever come back?" she asked. He didn't need to ask who she meant. Maybe he said. Or maybe they'll remember us when they're ready. Either way, we'll be here. She nodded, her eyes following the line of the mountains. "Then let's keep building until they do." Walter took her hand, rough against soft, and squeezed gently. Above them, a hawk circled in the sky, its cry sharp and distant. The day stretched thin, golden, and quiet, and for the first time, Cedar Hollow felt less like exile and more like belonging. The morning Helen Ward arrived. The sun had just begun to warm the frost off the grass. Walter was mending the fence near the edge of the clearing, and Margaret was hanging sheets that fluttered like sails in the thin mountain air. The sound of an approaching engine startled them both. It was a sound that no longer belonged to their world. A few moments later, a small blue Jeep limped into view, coughing smoke before it stopped completely near the gate. The driver's door opened, and a young woman stepped out. Her face flushed from the climb. "I'm so sorry to bother you," she called, waving a hand. "My car overheated. I just need some water if you have any to spare." Her voice carried the kind of city cadence that sounded foreign against the quiet hills. Margaret exchanged a glance with Walter before nodding. "Of course, dear," she said. "Come on up. You look like you've been through a war with that road." Helen laughed breathlessly as she followed them to the porch. Her jeans were streaked with dust, her camera hanging from her neck. "This place is incredible," she said, turning in a slow circle to take in the cabin, the small garden, the line of laundry swaying gently in the breeze. "I didn't think anyone still lived up here." Walter filled an old tin pitcher from the kitchen sink, the water running clear and cold. "Been here a while," he said. "Most folks don't find their way this far unless they're done or they're lost." Helen smiled. "Well, I guess I got lucky then." She poured the water into a rag and began wiping her hands, her eyes wandering toward the hand-carved sign above the door. "For as long as we can hold a hammer, we build." "Did you make that?" she asked. Walter nodded a little shyly. "Seemed true enough at the time." As Margaret handed her a cup of tea, Helen's curiosity deepened. She asked questions not like an intruder, but like someone collecting pieces of wonder. "How long have you lived here?" "Almost a year," Margaret said. "We came when we didn't have anywhere else to go." Helen tilted her head. "And you built all this yourselves?" Walter shrugged. "Didn't have much choice. You learn what you need when no one's around to do it for you." The younger woman smiled, something bright in her expression. That's exactly the kind of story people need to hear right now. She explained she worked for a small magazine called Rural America, which featured people who embodied resilience and hope. "I wasn't even supposed to be on this road," she admitted, "but maybe I was supposed to find you." At first, Walter resisted the idea of being photographed. "We're not much to look at," he said. But Margaret, amused, convinced him otherwise. "Let her take a few," she urged gently. "Maybe it's time someone else sees what we built." So they agreed. Helen spent the afternoon capturing the details that most people would overlook: the worn handle of Walter's hammer, the light falling through the jar of preserved berries, the way Margaret's hands brushed soil from a sprouting leaf. Before she left, she asked if she could send them a copy of the story once it ran. "It might take a few weeks," she said, "but I promise you'll like it." Walter helped her refill the Jeep's radiator, and when she drove off, the quiet seemed somehow louder than before. Life returned to its rhythm. The fence held steady, the garden flourished, and the days slipped into the kind of peace that didn't ask for anything more. Then one morning, about a month later, a thick envelope arrived in the mail drop at the base of the trail. Inside was a copy of Rural America. On the cover, beneath a photograph of their cabin framed by sunlight, the headline read, "The Couple Who Rebuilt a Dead Cabin." Margaret's breath caught. "She really did it," she whispered. They read the story together by the fire that evening. Helen had written about their journey not as tragedy, but as testament to people who refused to surrender, who built warmth where there had been ruin. The article ended with the line, "In Cedar Hollow, life began again, one nail, one seed, one day at a time." Within weeks, letters began to arrive. First one, then dozens, then hundreds. Some were from strangers who had lost homes, or loved ones thanking them for showing that it was still possible to start over. Others came from veterans' widows and single parents who saw themselves in the Whitlocks' stubborn hope. Margaret cried the first time she read one aloud. "Listen to this," she said. "Because of you, I planted a garden again." Walter pretended to keep busy, but his throat tightened as he listened. They placed every letter in a wooden box beside the fire, reading them slowly on quiet nights. "We thought the world forgot us," Margaret said one evening. "Seems like it was just waiting for us to remember ourselves first. But attention has a way of echoing farther than intended." One morning, another envelope arrived, thicker, official, with the return address printed in neat type. Margaret's hand trembled as she read the first line. "It's from Bradford," she whispered, "their eldest son." Her voice faltered. "He says he saw the article. He wants to visit." Walter set down his cup, his hand steady, though his pulse quickened. "After all this time?" he asked quietly. She nodded, her eyes filling. "And he's not the only one. Diana and Kevin wrote too. They all know now." The air in the cabin seemed to still the hum of the stove, suddenly distant. Outside, the wind carried the scent of rain, the kind that came just before a storm. Walter reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "Then I guess the past has found its way home." The rain started the morning. Thomas arrived, a slow, deliberate drizzle that soaked the mountain road and turned the air heavy with the scent of wet pine. Walter stood on the porch, his hands deep in his pockets, watching the silver sedan crawl up the winding path. It was too polished, too clean for this place. When the car stopped, Thomas stepped out first, tall, trim, his hair slicked back, a man who had spent too many years indoors. Behind him came a younger man in a tailored coat, carrying a briefcase. The sight alone made Walter's stomach tighten. Margaret appeared at the door beside him, clutching her shawl. "He brought a lawyer," she murmured, her voice trembling. Walter nodded slowly. "Then this won't be a visit for tea." Thomas climbed the steps with a confidence that didn't belong to the boy who had once helped his father build birdhouses in the backyard. "Dad. Mom." He offered a practiced smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You both look, well." Walter didn't return it. "What brings you all the way up here, son? Last I heard you preferred city skylines to mountain mud." Thomas glanced around his gaze, taking in the cabin, the garden, the old fence. "You've built quite a place. Rustic, picturesque. No wonder people are talking." The lawyer stepped forward, water dripping from his coat. "Mr. Whitlock, Mrs. Whitlock. My name is Stephen Wells. I represent your son's interests in a matter of family property." Walter's jaw tightened. "Family property?" Thomas cleared his throat. "I've been looking into some things since that article came out. Turns out this land sits within a development zone recently approved by the state. If you were to sell, it could fetch well over $1 million, maybe 1.2, depending on tourism projections." He paused, watching their faces. "That could change everything for all of us." Margaret's hand trembled around the edge of her shawl. "For all of us?" she asked softly. "We didn't come here to make money, Thomas. We came because we had nowhere else to go." Her son's smile thinned. And now you have options. You could move somewhere comfortable closer to medical care. You wouldn't have to live like this anymore. Walter's voice cut through calm but firm. This is what we chose. You sent us here to disappear, and we turned it into something worth living for. Don't come now and tell us it's wasted. Thomas's face hardened. Dad, be reasonable. You can't take this kind of property with you. You're almost 80. Mom's not well. We're just trying to do what's best. Walter took a slow step forward. If what's best for you means tearing down what we built with our hands, then maybe you should stop pretending it's for us. The lawyer cleared his throat, sensing the tension but pressing on. Mr. Whitlock, if you would just review these documents. Walter raised a hand. I don't need papers to tell me what something's worth. His gaze shifted back to his son. If that money could buy back the years we lost as a family or buy your mother another decade of health, I'd take it. But it can't. So no. The words landed like stones in the wet air. Thomas's expression flickered anger, disbelief, something close to shame, but he buried it quickly. You're being stubborn, he snapped. This isn't about pride, it's about reality. You can't live forever up here. Margaret's breathing grew uneven, her lips pale. Reality, she whispered. Reality was watching you all drive away the day we lost our home. Reality was counting coins to keep your father's truck running. Don't lecture us about what's real. She swayed, clutching the doorframe for balance. Walter reached for her, just as her knees gave way. Margaret, he shouted, catching her before she fell. The lawyer stepped back, uneasy, while Thomas froze his face, draining of color. For a moment, the rain was the only sound. Margaret struggled for air, her breaths shallow and wheezing. Walter lowered her onto the porch bench, shielding her from the wind. Get inside, he said sharply. She needs rest. Thomas hesitated, guilt flickering behind his composure. I didn't mean what Walter snapped. To come here and remind us how little we matter unless there's money attached. Thomas's voice rose raw now. We can't keep doing this. You two refuse help, refuse sense. Do you expect us to carry this burden forever? The word hung between them like thunder. Burden. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. She turned away, her voice breaking. You were never a burden to us, even when we had nothing. Thomas looked away, rain dripping from his hair, his expression tightening into something cold. I'm sorry, he said finally, though his tone betrayed no softness. I just can't watch this anymore. He turned to the lawyer. Let's go. Walter stepped forward, his voice quiet but heavy. You'll regret this someday. Thomas didn't answer. He descended the steps quickly, his shoes splashing through puddles, the car door slamming shut with finality. The engine roared to life, spitting mud as it reversed down the road. Margaret sobbed quietly in Walter's arms, her chest heaving against the rhythm of the rain. He stroked her hair, his voice low and steady. Breathe, love. Just breathe. The storm thickened, drumming against the roof, echoing the ache that had settled in his chest. Through the gray curtain of water, the taillights disappeared into the trees, leaving only the sound of wind and the bitter taste of what had been said. Walter sat there long after they were gone, holding the woman who had built everything beside him, wondering how love could survive when family forgot its shape. The summer ended without warning, and by early autumn the air in Cedar Hollow had grown dry and restless. Leaves turned brittle before they fell snapping underfoot like thin glass. Walter noticed the change before the news came, how the air carried the faint scent of smoke long before the horizon showed it. He tried to convince himself it was distant, that the wind would shift, that fires like that never climbed this high. But nature had its own plans, and by the first week of October, the valley below was burning. Margaret felt it before she saw it. It smells like the world is burning, she said one morning, standing on the porch with her shawl wrapped tight. A red haze hung in the sky, dimming the sunlight until everything glowed the color of old copper. Ash drifted down like strange snow settling on her shoulders, her hair the flowers she had planted. We should go, she whispered. Walter hesitated, watching the ridgeline where faint orange tongues flickered through the trees. Not yet, he said quietly. Maybe it'll pass us by. But by afternoon, the wind shifted, and the sound of sirens began to echo through the canyons. A pickup truck from the county pulled into the clearing, its lights flashing through the smoke. 2 firefighters jumped out, faces blackened with soot. "You folks need to evacuate," one said firmly. "The fire's coming fast from the South Ridge. You've got maybe half an hour." Margaret looked at Walter, fear wide in her eyes. He nodded slowly. "All right, we'll go." They packed quickly some clothes, her medication, the letters from strangers, and the journal she had been keeping. Margaret clutched it to her chest as though it were her heartbeat. Walter took one last look at the cabin, the porch where they had rebuilt their lives, the cedar shelves filled with jars of summer jam, the hand-carved words above the door now dim under the growing shadow of smoke. The firefighters waited by the truck as Walter helped Margaret inside. The road was narrow, winding through thick pines, the smoke closing in from both sides. Halfway down the trail, Walter turned to look back. Through the haze, the cabin was still visible, a small, dark shape against the burning hills. His throat tightened. "Stop the truck," he said suddenly. "I forgot something." The driver frowned. "Sir, we don't have time." Walter's voice was steady but resolute. "It won't take long." Margaret reached for his arm. "Walter, please." He pressed her hand gently. "Just one thing." Before anyone could argue, he stepped out of the truck and started back up the road. The climb felt endless. The heat grew stronger with each step, the air thick and choking. The mountain roared like a living thing. When he reached the clearing, the cabin stood shrouded in smoke, the edges of the forest glowing red. He stumbled inside, eyes-watering, lungs burning. The world blurred into flickering shapes. On the wall by the table hung their wedding photograph, black and white edges curled with age. Margaret's smile in the picture was soft, unguarded. He took it down and tucked it into his coat. Then he turned toward the shelf and grabbed the leather-bound journal, the one that had begun with Eleanor Whitmore's words, and now carried their own story written over it. "You'll come with me," he whispered hoarsely, clutching it to his chest. But the smoke was thick now, the air unbreathable. He tried to find the door, but the room spun. The heat pressed closer, stealing the edges of everything. He stumbled, struck the corner of the table, and fell to his knees. "Margaret," he gasped, though she wasn't there. His fingers scraped against the floorboards, finding nothing to hold. He crawled toward the faint outline of the window, but the light behind it had turned red. Each breath was fire. Somewhere in the distance, he thought he heard voices. Then nothing but the low, growing roar of the flames. His body gave in, and the journal slipped from his grasp, its pages scattering like birds. When Walter woke, the world smelled of antiseptic and smoke. A steady beeping filled the room. His throat ached, his lungs heavy as stone. White walls, a thin blanket, the hum of machines. He blinked against the harsh light until a shape came into focus, a nurse standing by his bed adjusting a drip. "You're awake," she said gently. "You're in Helena County Hospital. They found you near Cedar Hollow. You're lucky to be alive." His voice came out raw, barely a whisper, "Margaret." She hesitated, her eyes softening. She didn't make it out. The words hung in the air like ash. Walter stared at her, not understanding. "No," he said faintly. She was in the truck. The nurse looked down, her voice careful. There was a collapse near the second ridge. The crew tried to reach her, but the fire moved too fast. She placed a hand on his arm, her touch warm against the cold shock settling into his bones. "I'm sorry." Walter turned his head toward the window. Beyond it, the sky was pale gray, streaked with the faint smell of distant smoke. Somewhere below, engines rumbled as helicopters carried water toward what was left of the forest. He swallowed hard, his chest tight. "The cabin?" he asked. The nurse hesitated again. "Gone," she said softly. "But they found this." She reached into a small drawer and placed something beside his bed, a charred leather book. Edges blackened its cover, still faintly legible. EW 1954. He touched it with trembling fingers. The binding was scorched, but a few pages remained, the ink blurred but intact. He turned to one of Margaret's last entries. The writing wavered across the page, but the words were clear enough to read. If we have to leave this place, I want him to remember it as home." His breath caught. The nurse stood silently for a moment before walking away, leaving him alone with the sound of his heart monitor and the faint hiss of oxygen. Outside, the mountains were still burning, their glow barely visible through the haze like embers refusing to die. Walter closed his eyes, and for the first time since he woke, he let himself remember the smell of her hair, the sound of her laugh, the warmth of her hand in his. The morning of the funeral broke gray and silent, as if even the sky hesitated to begin the day. A thin mist hung over the small cemetery at the edge of Helena, softening the lines of the distant hills. Walter sat in the front row beneath a canvas canopy, his black coat too loose around his shoulders, his hands folded tightly in his lap. The scent of lilies and wet earth mixed with the faint trace of smoke still lingering in his clothes. Margaret's coffin rested before him, plain oak, polished to a dull shine. A single photograph lay atop it, her smiling in the garden sunlight tangled in her hair. Around them, only a few people had gathered, a handful of townsfolk who had known them by their quiet kindness, a nurse from the hospital and 3 children who now stood as strangers to their own father. Thomas was the first to approach him. He looked older than Walter remembered, his posture stiff beneath his dark suit, the weight of unspoken things pressing down on his face. Anna and Kevin followed close behind, their expressions uncertain, their eyes avoiding one another. They had not all been in the same place for years. For a moment, none of them spoke. The only sound was the low hum of wind moving through the pines. When the service began, the pastor's voice was low and patient, speaking of endurance and love that outlasted fire. Walter listened, but heard little. His gaze stayed fixed on the photograph, on the curve of her mouth, the soft lines around her eyes. Every word felt both too much and not enough. When it ended, people moved quietly, murmuring condolences that dissolved into the mist. One by one, they approached him, some placing a hand on his shoulder, others offering small nods of sympathy. Walter thanked them all, his voice steady, though his heart felt as hollow as the mountain now burned behind him. Thomas lingered until the others had gone. He stood beside his father, eyes fixed on the coffin. "She didn't want anything fancy," Walter said softly. "Just something simple, close to the earth." Thomas nodded. "She deserved more than simple," he replied, his voice cracking. Walter turned to look at him. "No, son. She deserved peace. That's what this is." For a long time, they said nothing. Then Thomas spoke again, his words barely more than a whisper. "I read the article again last night," he said. "The one that started all this. I kept thinking how proud I was, how beautiful it made everything sound. And then I realized I never understood what it really meant." He swallowed hard, his throat tight. "I thought you two were wasting your time here, that you were lost. But I was the one who couldn't see. I kept thinking you needed saving when you'd already saved yourselves." His voice faltered. "I thought you were a burden, Dad. But maybe we were the ones who forgot what matters." His hand trembled as he reached for his father's. Walter looked down at their joined hands, the roughness of his own, the fine, nervous grip of his son's, and nodded slowly. "It's not too late to learn," he said quietly. They stood together as the workers began to lower the coffin. The ropes creaked softly, the sound sharp in the still air. Walter's breath caught, but he didn't look away. He watched until the last corner of polished wood disappeared beneath the soil, and then he exhaled. The silence that followed was deep, almost reverent. Later, back at the small temporary house near the hospital, the family gathered in the living room. The fire in the hearth burned weakly, its glow thin but steady. Anna made tea, her hands shaking slightly as she poured. Kevin sat near the window, staring out at the overcast sky. Thomas sat across from his father, the weight of what he had said still hanging between them. "What will you do now?" he asked quietly. Walter took a long breath. "I don't know yet. Maybe I'll go back when the mountain cools. Maybe I won't. But there's something I need to give you first." He rose and crossed the room to the small suitcase he had brought from the hospital. From it, he drew out a leather-bound journal. Its edges scorched the initials, still faintly visible. View 1954. Thomas stared at it. Is that the one from the cabin? Walter nodded. It belonged to the woman who lived there before us. She wrote about building a life after losing everything. I added some of our own story after she stopped writing. He opened the first page, running his fingers over the faded ink. She said something once. If you're reading this, it means this place isn't dead yet. She was right. That cabin was more alive than most of the world. He handed the journal to his son. Read it. Then decide what you think is worth keeping. Thomas opened it slowly, turning through the brittle pages until he reached the section written in a more familiar hand. Near the end, his father's script wavered, but remained deliberate. He read aloud softly, "Everyone wants to save someone until they understand that what people really need is permission to stay with what they love." His voice broke the words, catching in his throat. "You wrote this?" he asked. Walter nodded. "Your mother understood it before I did. She didn't want saving. She wanted time to grow, to breathe, to belong. That's all any of us really want." The room fell silent again, but it was a gentler silence now, the kind that heals instead of wounds. Anna wiped her eyes with the corner of her sleeve. Kevin set his cup down and crossed to stand beside his father. "We were wrong," he said simply. Walter shook his head. "You were young. You did what you thought was right. The world teaches us to measure love in what we can give, but sometimes love is what we choose not to take away." Thomas closed the journal and held it close to his chest. "I'd like to come back with you," he said quietly, "to see what's left, to help rebuild if it can be rebuilt." Walter met his gaze and saw for the first time in years the boy who used to watch him work in the yard, hammering nails with too much force but all the heart in the world. "Then we'll see," he said softly. Outside, the clouds began to thin. A faint beam of light slipped through, glinting off the window pane. Walter looked toward it, his reflection faint in the glass, his heart heavy, but no longer hollow. Somewhere beyond the smoke and ruin, the mountain still waited quiet and patient, as always. 1 year after the fire, Cedar Hollow had begun to heal. The charred trees on the ridge stood like solemn witnesses, their blackened trunks softened by the faint green of new growth pushing through the ash. The mountain, stubborn and enduring, had kept its promise: life always returns. Thomas drove the winding road slowly, the same road he had once climbed in anger. The air was clearer now, the scent of pine sharper, cleaner. In the passenger seat lay the leather-bound journal and a small photograph of his parents standing beside the rebuilt water pipe, both smiling beneath a sky that seemed impossibly blue. The cabin had changed since he last saw it. Where ruins once stood, a small team of carpenters and volunteers had rebuilt it from its foundation, guided by the old plans Walter had drawn decades before. The new boards were lighter in color, the roof stronger, the windows wider. But the soul of the place, the warmth, the humility remained. Thomas stepped out of the truck, his shoes sinking slightly into the damp soil. The wind carried the smell of cedar and rain. Helen Ward was already there, clipboard in hand, her hair pulled back beneath a hat. "You made it," she said, smiling. "I wouldn't miss it," Thomas replied. She gestured toward the sign, newly mounted beside the path, the Hayes Hollow House. Community library and rest stop. The letters were carved by a local craftsman, deep and clean, the wood sealed with oil. Below it, a smaller plaque read, "Dedicated to Walter and Margaret Hayes, who built love from ruin." Thomas traced the engraving with his fingers. "They'd laugh if they saw this," he said quietly. "They'd say they never planned to leave a monument." Helen tilted her head. "Maybe that's what makes it one." Inside, the cabin had been transformed, yet every detail carried a trace of their story. The shelves that once held jars of jam, now lined with books donated from across the state, stories of resilience letters from readers who had written after the article, journals from those who had found courage in what the couple left behind. Near the window stood the old cabinet Walter had built its doors, restored the carved words inside, preserved beneath clear varnish. Thomas opened it gently and read them again. "For as long as we can hold a hammer, we build." He felt his throat tighten. Helen watched him silently before saying, "We thought it should stay exactly as it was. People will read it and understand what this place means." That afternoon, the small ceremony began. A few townspeople gathered along with volunteers, local officials, and several elderly visitors who would soon call this cabin a resting place on their long trails. Thomas stood before them, the mountain at his back, sunlight spilling over the clearing. He spoke without notes, his voice steady but filled with quiet emotion. "A year ago this was only smoke and memory, but my parents believed that nothing truly built with love ever dies. My father used to say that wood remembers the hands that shape it. Maybe that's true of people too." He paused, looking toward the hills where the first green leaves trembled in the wind. "They came here with nothing but each other, and somehow they made that enough. This house isn't just a cabin. It's a reminder that home is not a place we find, but something we build again and again, even when the world tells us it's too late." The audience was silent, the kind of silence that listens. Thomas opened the worn leather journal and read the passage his father had written on the last surviving page. "Everyone wants to save someone until they understand that what people really need is permission to stay with what they love." His voice softened. He wrote this for all of us. And I think he meant that love doesn't always look like rescue. Sometimes it looks like standing still beside the people who refuse to give up. He closed the journal carefully and set it on the table near the window. Helen stepped forward, handing him a small, ribboned bundle, a framed copy of the original article that had started everything. "They'd be proud," she whispered. Thomas smiled faintly. "They'd probably tell us to stop fussing and get back to work." As the sun began to set, golden light flooded the clearing, spilling across the rebuilt walls. The air shimmered with heat and memory. Thomas walked to the porch, his footsteps echoing softly against the new boards. He turned to the small crowd, then back to the cabin. "Before we finish," he said, "I want to read something carved here long before I understood it." He reached for the inside of the door and spoke the words slowly, his voice carrying through the quiet air. "For as long as we can hold a hammer, we build, whether it is a house or a memory." For a moment, no one moved. Then the wind rose, brushing through the trees as if the mountain itself exhaled. Thomas looked out toward the ridgeline, where the last light of day painted the peaks in gold. The sky burned soft with color, the same amber hue that once glowed through the cabin's windows when his parents sat together by the fire. He imagined his mother there, her hands folded over her notebook, her face turned toward the setting sun, teaching him again in silence the lesson she had lived by, that love endures. Not because it is easy, but because it survives the test of time, of fire, and of loss. He stood there until the first stars appeared, their light faint but constant, and he whispered to the mountain, "We're still building, Mom, just like you taught us." Behind him, the cabin glowed warmly against the dusk, a small, steadfast light on the edge of the wilderness, waiting for whoever needed to believe that it was never too late to begin again. If this story moved, you take a moment to let me know. Click. Like if you felt something real in Walter and Margaret's journey, and subscribe so you don't miss the next story I share. I'd love to hear from you. What part of their life in Cedar Hollow stayed with you the most? Was it the rebuilding, the loss, or the way they found peace at the end? And where are you watching or reading from tonight? Leave a comment below and tell me. I always like to know where the stories find their listeners.